A young boy pointed at the judge and said, "You're the killer." Seconds later, she walked out. What was she running from? The courtroom in Birmingham, Alabama, was packed. The wooden benches creaked as people shifted, whispering under their breath. The air was thick, heavy, like a storm about to break. On one side, the prosecutor's table was piled high with legal pads and documents. On the other, the defense attorney sat, poised and calm, his client a former police officer resting in his chair, too relaxed for a man facing murder charges. But all eyes were on the witness stand. 14-year-old Jamir Matthews sat rigid, his hands tightly clasped, knuckles white, eyes wide and darting to the jury, 12 strangers watching, waiting. His mother sat just a few feet away, her fingers clutching the edge of her seat, her chest rising and falling with each breath, as if her body was the only sign she was alive. "State your name for the record," the prosecutor said, standing before him. Jamir swallowed, adjusting the microphone. His voice was softer than he wanted. "Jamir Matthews." "And how old are you, Jamir?" 14. The prosecutor nodded, his face holding the kind of expression adults use when they want to be gentle, but Jamir could see the strategy behind it. "You understand why you're here today, right?" Jamir's throat tightened. He didn't need a reminder. His father, Donnell Matthews, had spent his life fighting for the voiceless, teaching Jamir to stand up and speak out against injustice. But now, fear gripped him. His fingers curled into his jeans as he forced himself to say it. "I'm here because my dad was killed." A deep silence fell over the room. The defense attorney didn't even look up from his papers, tapping his pen absent-mindedly. Officer Brian Keating, the man Jamir was testifying against, sat still, his face an emotionless mask, his hands folded neatly in his lap. The prosecutor stepped forward. "Tell us what you remember from that night." Jamir closed his eyes, the memory rising unbidden. "It wasn't hard to recall, it was always there, waiting. It was late, almost midnight. My dad had just left a meeting. He was working on a case about a kid who got arrested for something he didn't do." Jamir's voice faltered, but he pushed on. "We stopped at a gas station. My dad was at the pump, and I went inside to grab a soda." He hesitated, his throat tightening. He could still hear it, the sharp crack of a gunshot. Time stretched in those few seconds, and the courtroom was held in a breathless silence. Jamir cleared his throat. "I heard the shot and ran outside. My dad was on the ground, blood everywhere, and the man standing over him had a gun." The prosecutor nodded, giving him space to continue. "Do you see that man in the courtroom today?" Jamir's gaze snapped to the defense table. Officer Keating met his eyes with no flicker of emotion. "Yeah," Jamir said, his voice steady. "It's him." A murmur rippled through the room. The judge raised a hand to silence it. The prosecutor stepped forward again. "Officer Keating claims your father threatened him, that he feared for his life. Did you see anything that would suggest your father was violent?" Jamir's jaw clenched. "No. My dad wasn't like that." The prosecutor nodded, then asked, "Did he have a weapon?" Jamir's fingers dug into the armrest. His heart pounded in his chest. "No, he didn't have anything." The prosecutor turned to the jury, letting those words sink in. But the defense attorney suddenly shifted, adjusting his tie, his voice smooth as he interjected. "Objection, Your Honor. He was inside the store at the time of the shooting. He can't possibly know what happened before he ran outside." Judge Evelyn Carter didn't flinch, her gaze steady. "Sustained. Please rephrase the question." Jamir's stomach churned. He could feel the weight of the room pressing on him, but he wasn't done yet. He tightened his grip on the armrest, his heart hammering against his ribs. The judge's voice was calm, almost too calm as she addressed the prosecutor. "You may continue." The prosecutor cleared his throat. "Jamir, when you ran outside after hearing the gunshot, did you see your father do anything aggressive?" Jamie shook his head. No. Did you hear him say anything? He paused, the gas station lights casting long shadows across the pavement, warping the memory. But his father's voice remained clear, faint but distinct. Yeah, Jamie said softly. He said please. The word hung heavy in the air. The prosecutor leaned in, eager. Just please? Jamie nodded. That's all I heard, just please. His mother, seated in the front row, let out a shaky breath. The defense attorney shifted again, preparing to counter. The prosecutor turned toward the jury. So let's be clear. Your father's last words weren't a threat. He wasn't attacking anyone. He was begging. Jamie finished, his voice firm. Just begging. A ripple passed through the courtroom. The defense attorney sighed, standing, his suit crisp and unruffled. Jamie, he said, his voice measured. I know this is difficult, but you were inside the store when the incident happened. Is it possible your father reached for something? Maybe Officer Keating thought he saw a weapon? Jamie's chest tightened. He knew what they were doing, trying to turn his father into a threat, even from beyond the grave. He shook his head. No. Are you absolutely sure? Yes. The defense attorney glanced toward the jury, planting doubt in their minds before sitting back down, satisfied. Jamie could feel it, how people's faces shifted, how the room wasn't entirely on his side, how the truth seemed to be slipping away. But something was wrong. Jamie's eyes flickered toward Judge Carter. Her expression was unreadable, but something about her felt off. She wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking past him, somewhere else. Her eyes held a flicker of hesitation, something Jamie couldn't name, but he saw it. The prosecutor, noticing Jamie's focus, pressed on. Do you remember what happened after the police arrived? Jamie's jaw tightened. Yeah. They put me in a squad car. Said they needed me out of the way. The defense attorney spoke up again, his voice smooth. For your protection, correct? Jamie turned toward him. No. They never told me that. A hush swept through the room. The prosecutor seized the moment. So just to clarify, your father was unarmed, shot by an off-duty officer, and instead of comforting you, the police locked you in a squad car. Jamie nodded. Yeah. Did they let you see your father? His throat tightened. No. His mother closed her eyes, clutching her hands tightly in her lap. The prosecutor turned toward the jury. Jamie's focus was now entirely on the judge. And then, it happened. A brief flicker, almost imperceptible, but Jamie saw it. Judge Carter's fingers twitched. Her jaw shifted slightly. She knew something. Jamie could feel it in his bones. This wasn't just about one bad cop. Something bigger was at play here, buried deep. Jamie wasn't ready to let it stay buried. His pulse pounded in his ears as he turned his gaze to Judge Carter. For the first time, he saw it in her eyes, the truth she was hiding. And then it clicked. He stood taller, his breath steady despite the fear clawing at him. He locked eyes with the judge, and then he said it. You're the killer. The words cut through the room, freezing everyone in place. The prosecutor's mouth fell open. The defense attorney's pen slipped from his hand. The jurors stiffened in their seats. Even Officer Keating, so controlled, tilted his head slightly in surprise. But the judge? She didn't flinch. Her fingers twitched, the only sign of life. Her lips pressed into a thin line. A long silence followed. Jamie didn't blink. He could feel his mother's breath hitch behind him, could hear the murmurs from the spectators, but none of it mattered. The judge still hadn't said a word. The air in the room was thick with unspoken tension. Then, the judge leaned forward. Her voice was even, dangerously calm. Excuse me. Jamir didn't back down. He could feel the weight of the room pressing on him, waiting for him to crack, to apologize. But he wouldn't. You knew, Jamir said, his voice quieter now but no less certain. The courtroom exhaled, not in relief, but in shock. Judge Carter didn't move. She didn't deny it. But her knuckles were white against the bench. She wasn't responding, but she didn't need to. Jamir saw it all in her face, the guilt, the fear, the knowledge. The defense attorney shot to his feet, protesting. Objection, Your Honor. This is an outrageous accusation from a child. But the damage was done. The courtroom wasn't just watching anymore. They were listening. Jamir's mother stood up. The entire room turned toward her. Her hands were shaking, but her face was set, unmovable.